Welcome back, Dreamers, and today we take you through this classic pale ale recipe and one that's going to get a very special place here on Billabong Views. Find out about that shortly. Let's get into it. Now, I love a good pale ale, that burst of those citrusy hops, that balance of the malts and the smooth bitterness. And this recipe today is no different. So much so, it's going to be our signature pale ale. It's going to be known as our BVPA. Pretty sure some of you have worked out what that's going to be. So without further ado, let's talk about a pale ale. Up to the 18th century at least, the bulk of the beers produced in England were of a dark brown colour, brewed largely from amber and brown malts. Malt drying technology was somewhat crude in those days, and the so-called pale malts would have been quite dark compared to modern malts today. Pale ale certainly existed before 1700, but even in the 18th century it was not a defined style. An important milestone came in 1790 when George Hodgson began to ship pale ale to India. By the first quarter of the 19th century, the Burton-on-Trent brewers had lost their export trade to the Baltic countries as a result of the embargoes put in place during the Napoleonic Wars. By this time, Hodgson had taken firm control of India exports, but had been at odds with the East India Company. So a director of the company approached Samuel Allsop in Burton and asked him whether he could brew pale ale for the Indian market. In 1822, the first brew was made, and it was shipped to India in 1823. Burton maltsters supposedly developed a special pale malt for this brew, and certainly the highly mineralised Burton water, whose hardness accentuated the hop bitterness in the beer, was well suited to the production of what became Indian Pale Ale. IPA was a strong beer at around 7%, but lower strength versions began to be produced, and these were often referred to simply as Pale Ale. But Pale Ale production was not limited to Britain alone. Belgian brewers developed several examples of varying alcoholic strengths. These are more characterised by fruity notes from the distinctive Belgian yeast used in their production than the malt and hop flavour of British beers. Oddly enough, apart from Cooper's Sparkling Ale from Adelaide in South Australia, pale ale is rare in the countries of the British Commonwealth. In the United States, because of the surge of German immigrants bringing lager brewing with them, pale ale did not really become a big factor in the 19th century. Around the 80s and 90s, the US craft brewing revolution began. These new brewers with little brewing heritage to draw on looked to Europe and Britain in particular for inspiration. Pale ale was simpler to produce and required less capital investment than lager, and most craft brewers opted for it. US brewers wanted to go back to the roots of pale ale and to explore the possibilities of the wide variety of American hops available to them. The result was that American pale ale became a new style. Okay, so let's get into today's recipe. First up is our water additions. Please note that all water additions are to change my water, which is rainwater. Additions will be different depending on the starting water makeup. Those living in town will likely be able to get their mains water profile from your local council. As always, we're using the Brewfather app, a great tool if you're getting into brewing. Today we are going with the Hoppy water profile. It is one of the preset water profiles when using the Brewfather app. Now, my recipe is available on Brewfather, and in today's brew we have 4 kilos of ale malt, 220 grams of crystal malt, which will add colour and a malty sweetness, and 220 grams of carapils, which will be for head retention and mouthfeel. In this mash, we'll do it 67 degrees for 60 minutes. We're going to use the slightly higher mash temperature, which will cause the sugars to be less fermentable and making it harder for the yeast to eat through, resulting in a higher end gravity, which will produce a beer with a thicker mouthfeel and slightly sweeter. We'll then do a mash out at 75 degrees for 10 minutes. You will note as the mash goes along that it does get a little bit darker, and this is from the crystal malt as they are kilned a little bit longer and they produce that darker amber colour into the brew. Most modern day home brewers will be using hop pellets to get the hops into their beer. Hop pellets are simply fresh hops that have been crushed down and compacted into pellets. We'll be doing a reasonably large addition of Whirlpool hops today, also known as a hop stand. We'll be doing 30 grams of Cascade and 30 grams of Citra to add that big fruity burst into our pale ale. The yeast we're using today is a USO5 yeast, which is a fairly neutral yeast and allows the hops and the malt to stand on their own. For our dry hop addition, we're going to be using these stainless steel tea strainers, readily available online and quite cheap as well. Being stainless steel, they're quite easy to sterilise and sanitise. Again, a nice large addition of dry hops with 20 grams of Cascade and 20 grams of Citra to add that nice fresh fruity hop flavour into our end beer. And our tasting notes for our pale ale, the aroma is of tropical fruit and citrus with an almost sweet maltiness. The flavour is of tropical fruit, namely pineapple, grapefruit and lime. There's a slight sweetness and smooth malt, and there's a medium bitterness on the finish. Overall, this is a very easy drinking beer and that classic pale ale flavour. It's slightly thicker in the mouthfeel from our 67-degree mash temperature. I can see why this will be a favourite Billabong Views staple and why it has been chosen for our first Signature Series brew. Don't forget to stick around for more videos to come. Hit that subscribe button, make sure you're getting all the notifications, and we will see you next time on Billabong Views.